When I was at university, I studied a communications degree, which spoke about how media and communication technology influenced not only the way a message was sent, but also perceived. One small example is that concentrating on the headlines and reducing news down to 10-second sound bites tends to lead us to believe that all news can be deconstructed down to those things. Over time, we can ignore the longer, more involved reasons behind a news story and focus on the visceral impact of things like violence and suffering because that is what the story focuses on. As a result, that influences how we perceive the world and how we behave in it. The upshot of this is that there has been an interesting change in the way we take in information, including news and also entertainment, over the past few generations. This change has happened gradually at first, but has started to increase in both speed and scale in recent times as new technology has spread. The changes from books and print to movies and video, and then to games and interaction. I think this is a profound change, and we ignore it at our peril. Originally, back in my grandparents' generation, and that of the baby boomers, the main form of entertainment and of getting information and news was from reading. The newspaper was delivered and read every morning around the kitchen table. Children were read to by their parents and were taught to read at a young age so that they could go to school and basically have access to longer and more important books. Literacy and numeracy were a high priority, and not being able to read was seen not only as a failure of education, but also somehow as a failure of character. The emphasis was on long-form storytelling. People read novels and got invested in them. Radio would broadcast serials, and people would have favourite characters and adventures. This type of information would generally lead to a way of thinking that was very linear. Generally, facts were presented in a very linear fashion, and people would take them at face value and think about them and consider what they would do. There was time to think and discuss and weigh up options to conclude about what action to take. Decisions weren't taken lightly because it was assumed that all the information was presented to you in an orderly, logical fashion, so you could trust what they were saying. This led to a form of linear thinking that tended to favour logical deduction. You started with a premise and then followed a linear chain of reasoning down to a logical conclusion. If something was true everywhere, then you could basically rest assured that it was true where you are as well. This type of thinking then generally leads to a lot of long-chain deductive reasoning and practical problem solving, as most people were expected to be able to take care of themselves after a certain age and be generally self-reliant. When my parents were growing up, there was a change in the way information and entertainment was presented in the form of television. This meant that information had to be compressed down from a newspaper and reduced so that it could fit into a half-hour time slot. The news was reduced to the headlines and the first few paragraphs of a news story. Only the essentials were covered, and because of ratings, news had to be more entertaining. This means that it had to focus on what the public was interested in, which is very different from what is in the public's interest. At this time, movies became more of a thing as they were shown on TV, and the TV series supplanted the radio serial as the entertainment of choice. The way those were constructed, though, was very different from a linear step-by-step brain process of reading the written word. In TV, things jump around all the time. The camera cuts away and shows the same thing from a different angle. Information is communicated by an actor's posture and body language rather than by a description. Sometimes even just the music or the lighting is expected to carry the meaning behind the story. Some may argue that this makes movies and TV more realistic than reading because you must take in all this information in day-to-day life. But movies or TV are not like real life. TV contains dramatic tropes, such as good guys and bad guys, and dramatic tension and action, none of which is actually present in real life. As a generation who has grown up with television, we learn to understand those tropes and apply them readily to the real world, even though they don't always fit. The real problem with TV, though, is that it tends to provoke a different style of thinking. Because TV isn't as linear as books and reading, it tends to provoke an inductive rather than deductive style of thinking. This means that information is taken from a whole lot of different sources, such as plot, dialogue, body language, music, lighting, etc., and all brought together to form a picture of what is going on. This is the opposite of deductive thinking. Instead of looking at the whole world and thinking that it must also apply to our corner, we look at our corner and think that that must also apply to the whole world. We can see the issues in lives and then immediately apply those same ideas, prejudices, and problems to everyone else and create a narrative around them. Having this kind of thinking is not bad. It actually equips people much better for the rapid pace of change in the world and to be able to cope with the task of dealing with the enormous amount of information that we're exposed to today. But it does mean that people are not that good at logical reasoning and critical thinking. We make a whole bunch of assumptions and treat them as facts because we haven't practiced the reflection necessary to discern what is true and what isn't. However, this next generation is growing up beyond TV. Even now, television watching has tended to fall by the wayside in preference to things like YouTube and streaming services. I will control what I watch and when I watch it. Also, even more than that, a lot of entertainment is in the form of video games. The entertainment of choice for young people is almost entirely interactive. Now I get to be the protagonist in my own story and make my own choices. I can filter out any opinion I see as being contrary to my own, and I can vehemently attack those who are not in my tribe and who challenge my narrative. I wonder what type of thinking that taking in information this way will lead to. How will young people's brains react to this amount of choice and agency in their entertainment and newsfeed? We will need to be aware of our own choices and be able to understand how to take responsibility for those choices and where they lead us. Who we are is defined as much by what we watch as by what we do. That's something I wish they taught me at school.